Well, thank you again for being with us. Thank you for joining us on this 4th of July weekend. I imagine there's lots and lots of other things that we could be doing than spending this hour together this Sunday. There's a lot going on this weekend. So thank you for taking the time for being with us. And if you're tuning in later on the video stream, thank you for joining us. We're gonna talk about several different things today and kind of try to bring them together, always to the point of view of, well, what does it mean to me spiritually? What does it mean to me as a spiritual being? We want to look at a little bit of the history of the American Declaration of Independence, what that was about, and what that means. And it's certainly much more significant than just a political statement of one group of people making a statement to another. There's something very, very deep, very wonderful going on there that we need to explore. We want to look at it in spiritual terms as described by Dr. Emmett Fox in his little pamphlet, the Historical Destiny of the United States, which for those of you who have ebook readers, you can get it at Barnes & Noble. It's 99 cents. If you have a Nook reader on your device, you can read it for $1, which is probably a good homework assignment for this weekend. And we're going to look at it in terms of, but why? But why? What is the purpose of our freedom? What is the purpose of our liberty? Do we have license? Do we have liberty? Or is there something even deeper that we're going for? Liberation, So when I first started to think of the ideas of the talk, when they first started to come to me, it was license, liberty, or liberation was what seemed to be the theme that was rolling through there. We have freedom or bondage, we have license or liberty, and then we have liberation. We want to try to touch on these things and bring them together. And I guess my hopes are that the ideas that we discussed today will set into motion a deeper exploration on the part of those listening. Maybe go find Dr. Fox's pamphlet, download a copy for $1 and read it and think about it. What does that mean? Think about the historical facts behind the Declaration of Independence. What do they mean? Think about, but what does it mean to me? See, what does it mean to me personally? It's one thing to study all of these things in the abstract of what happened 240 years ago to a group of people who are long gone. But what does it mean to me today in terms of my spiritual growth? So I want to read something to you from the very first page of the Science of Mind textbook in the chapter The Thing Itself, written by Ernest Holmes. Excuse me. It's the second paragraph in the book. To suppose that the creative intelligence of the universe would create humankind in bondage and leave them bound would be to dishonor the creative power which we call God. To suppose that God could make humans as individuals without leaving them to discover themselves would be to suppose an impossibility. Individuality must be spontaneous. It can never be automatic. Individuality, the seed of freedom must be planted in the innermost being of man. But like the prodigal son, man must make the great discovery for himself. This very, very second chapter of the textbook, and he starts to deal with this issue of bondage or freedom and our responsibility as individuals to make the discovery. And I would add to that, once we make the discovery, then what? So what? What difference does it make? It's one thing to walk around and say, well, yes, I'm free. And it's another thing to actually live that freedom, and live that freedom for a purpose. Free from what? What are we free from? Why are we free? What do we do with our freedom? we could be locked up in solitary confinement and we could say that we were free. That doesn't make it so. So we want to kind of explore those ideas today. As I say, we're going to approach them from several different directions. Now, the 4th of July weekend brings back great memories for me as a kid, and I'm sure for a lot of people. As I told you, I grew up in a beach-like area in New York City. If you look at a map in New York City where Kennedy Airport is, there's a little island out in that bay that's called Jamaica Bay. There's a little island out in there, and I lived on that island. So for those of you down by Wilmington, you can kind of get the image of like Harbor Island there. You go over one bridge and you get to the beach. You go over a bridge the other direction, you get to the mainland. And I grew up in an area kind of like that. I grew up in a small fishing village in the middle of New York City. It's quite a unique experience. Summertime was always a time of celebration because we had an influx of people who only came for the summer. You know, they came, they rented houses, or they owned a house that they only used in the summer, and they would all come. And then after Labor Day, they would all go back to wherever they lived elsewhere in New York City. But the street that I lived on, the little road, just kind of was not much wider than that stuck out into the water. There was one. And then there was houses on either side of it, and behind those houses were canals where people tied up their boats. And as kids, we could walk out to the very edge of the road, and the expanse there was nothing but water and salt marsh. For those of you who are on Facebook, I posted a picture that somebody took from that spot where I lived. They took this picture and they published it in a newspaper. There's nothing but water and salt marsh, you know, just very flat. Towers of some bridges off in the distance. And as kids, we would go down there, and you could kind of look at this great expanse of water, you know. And if we turned at night, if we turned to the south, we would be looking out over the peninsula, over the beach into the Atlantic Ocean, where they towed the fireworks barges for Rockaway Beach. And they did that every Tuesday night during the summer, and of course 4th of July was a big celebration. But we would just sit there and be able to look and could see the fireworks. Didn't have to get in the car, didn't have to go anywhere. Just go down the end of the road and sit there and watch the fireworks. And if we turn to the west a little bit further, that was the direction of Coney Island. And there too, they towed a barge off the beach and they would shoot off the fireworks. And they would usually have it weekly. I think Rockaway was Tuesday and Coney Island was Wednesday. But 4th of July, they were all going. And then if we turned even a little bit further, you know, swung around, you had the skyline of New York City in the background. And we could just see the fireworks on the East River. You know, if you watch on TV, you see the Macy's fireworks display on the East River. They always have a fantastic display. And as a kid, I could sit right there at the street and I could look out. Now, they were almost on the horizon. It was some distance away to New York. But we could see them nonetheless, you know. So there's great memories of these celebrations and barbecues and cookouts and sparklers and fireworks and all of the things that we did as kids. Celebrating our independence, you know. And I think it's interesting if you ask people today, what is the 4th of July all about? What are we celebrating on this Independence Day? You might get an answer, something to the effect of, well, it's when we declared our independence from Great Britain. And I think it's interesting. I actually had this discussion with someone a week or so ago, and I said, well, who is this we? Who is this we that declared their independence? I mean, I wasn't here, you weren't here. Who is this we? In many cases, the we that they're talking about, the people who are talking, their ancestors weren't even here yet. Their ancestors hadn't even emigrated to this country yet. They came long after the revolution was over. But yet there's something about this act of declaring independence that they identify with. See, the we. And if you go back into the history, I love to read history, and I love to read alternative histories, because that's when you start to get a bigger picture view of what was going on. Because history was written by the winners. Everybody writes the history, and we were the good guys, they were the bad guys, and we had to fight them because they were doing terrible things. And of course, if you read the history from the other side, it says, well, we were the good guys, they were the bad guys, they were doing terrible things, but we lost because because they just they did even more terrible things. But keep in mind, that if we go back and look at the history, we can kind of get a feel for where human consciousness was. I think of history, when we read history, I think of history as a record of the unfoldment of human consciousness. Like, where was human consciousness at that point in the development of society? Where was the unfoldment? We talked a couple weeks ago about involution and evolution, right? So the involution is the declaration, the speaking of the word. And the evolution is the unfoldment of events as that word comes into demonstration. So in biblical terms, God could say, let there be plants and animals of every kind. In the scientific realm, we have the evolution, the development of the plants and the animals of every kind, the involution and the evolution. But if we look at history, if we look at human history, at any given point in time, we can kind of see where human consciousness was, where it was going, what was important, all of those things. What did people believe? And as Emmett Fox tells us, the reason that we can read a document that was written 4,000 years ago and we can understand the mindset of the people, is that really as a collective human race, as a collective we, consciousness hasn't changed that much. We haven't evolved that much. We have better technology, we have better tools, we have better communication. But if you look at what I call the level of maturation of consciousness, how far has consciousness evolved along the way? It hasn't changed that much. It hasn't changed terribly much. We're not far from the cave dwellers, I think Emmett Fox would say. I remember going to Phoenix. I worked in Phoenix for several months in 1987. And had a chance to go out and visit the Anasai ruins. And I think Anasai just is a Native American term for the ancient people. And these are people who lived there a long time ago, and they left. For some reason they disappeared. And the anthropologists are still trying to figure out exactly why, what happened to them, where did they go. But these people, the ruins that we were looking at were from somewhere around 1000 AD. And as I stood there and I looked at it, I realized how smart these people were, how intelligent they were. They built their dwelling into the side of a cliff, and it was I guess what would have been the equivalent of an apartment house today. There were several levels built in the side of the cliff, and there were multiple rooms in each level. And it was facing the south. It was solar heated, so in the wintertime the sunlight would come in and it would warm everybody. It was a great place to defend themselves against any type of enemy, whether it be an animal or whether it be a human, because the intruder couldn't get at them from the top and couldn't get at them from the bottom. These people would go up ladders, and once they got where they're going, they pulled the ladders up. People couldn't get to them. They had a rope pulley system, kind of like an elevator, but they had a rope and pulley system where they could hoist up the food and the water. It was built right on the banks of a creek. They had plenty of fresh water, and they dug irrigation ditches that are still in use today by the people farming the land today. They dug irrigation ditches to divert the flow of the creek through the fields so that whatever they were growing in the fields would get plenty of water. And as I stood there, I felt a kinship with these people. I felt one with these people. They were not so different than I. I may have other tools. I may have other technology, but these folks were not so different, They wanted a good place to live, to raise their crops, to raise their family, a safe place. Fundamental things that all of humankind wants. And my point is that probably when I was a child, I would look back and say, well, these were people who lived 1,000 years ago. That was forever. But as an adult, I could go there and say, I understand. I think I understand what it would be like to be a person who lived here in this environment, because human consciousness, it hasn't changed all that much. So if we look at recorded history, and as I said, you have to take the precautions to understand that history is written by the winners. So you're only getting one side. You have to go seek out a contrary position, several of them, and read through them, and then try to decide for yourself. Because neither side is giving the whole picture. They are each trying to flatter themselves. If you want to read something that I found amusing when I was studying about the American Revolution here in backwoods South Carolina, is there was a British officer, Bannister Tarleton was his name, and if you ever saw the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, the wicked British officer was loosely based on Bannister Tarleton's reputation. Of course, that whole movie was kind of loosely based on history. It was shot right here in Rock Hill, by the way, right in this area. But Tarleton had a terrible reputation here for being brutal, and he suffered a significant defeat here at the Battle of Cowpens, which is just up the road near Gaffney, South Carolina. And after the war, Cornwallis was kind of writing his apology about the war, why the war was lost. And he of course blamed the whole thing on Tarleton. If Tarleton hadn't been so brash and all the things that he did, why, if he hadn't been defeated at Cowpens, it wouldn't have set in motion the events that led to the surrender at Yorktown. And Tarleton, on the other hand, he kind of stayed out of the fray, but some of his friends came in and they started writing books. There's this whole series of books that are still available on the internet in England, and they've got titles about 30 words long, and it says The Errors with the Thinking of the Honorable So-and-so, who's just a complete fool when it comes to, if you've watched CNN and watched the members of Parliament, you kind of get the feel for what's going on. And my only point there is that you have to read both sides. You have to read both sides of that, because history is written by the winners. A little factoid about history in regard to the American Revolution. When I was a kid, we studied the American Revolution, and we learned that Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown and the war was over. That's the way I remember it as a kid. Well, that wasn't true. Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, and the war was officially in progress for another 2 years. Now, there were minor skirmishes going back and forth. For the most part, the fighting was over. But the British still had troops stationed up in New York, and it took 2 years before the Treaty of Paris was negotiated. Just little things that we don't pick up on. So, the first point I want to make is that we look at this Declaration of Independence and we say that's when we decided that we were going to declare our independence from Great Britain. But who is the we? Who is the we? I wasn't here. My folks weren't here. Who was the we? Do we identify with the we, the Federalists of Hamilton, the rich merchants of the Northeast, who, by the way, believed that the people who owned the country, the wealthy business people, they were the ones who should govern it? Do we identify with the we as being, Jefferson, the planter class, the slave owners who could write in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and still at the same time hold slaves? How can that be? It boggles the mind. But that was another mindset. There was another class of we. It was the Jefferson's idea of we. And then here in backwoods Carolinas, you had the farmers. You didn't have the rich plantation owners. You had the mom and pop farms. You had the homesteaders, the people who were trying to make their living from the soil, who were trying to build a better life for themselves and their family, and all they wanted was enough land to farm and to give homesteads to their children when their children became old enough for farms, so that the family could stay together. Probably much like you would imagine the Amish communities up in Pennsylvania today. And they were an entirely different we. They didn't associate with the rich planters from the east. In fact, they were the enemies. The planters were trying to steal the land that the farmers were developing. They'd let the farmers develop the land, clear the land, make it profitable, and then they would have their friends, the tax collectors and the politicians, find a way to push the farmers off of the land. so that the rich people could take it over and use slave labor to work it and make a fortune. And back before the revolution here in the Carolinas in the 1760s, there's this thing called the War of Regulation, where the backwoods farmers had a rebellion, an armed rebellion against the colonial governors to try to stop the corruption. And I only mention that because, first of all, our understanding of history is probably incomplete, but second of all, there were many different we's. There were many different we's. So when the preamble to the Constitution says "we the people," which we are we talking about? And yet we all read that and say, well, that's me, right? That's me. I am the very center of that universe of we the people. So historically, there was not a we, not a collective we. There were several different groups of we's who kind of came together at that time, and each had their own agenda that they could use the rebellion to further their purpose. But there was not a collective we that we think of today. So why then, what is it about this act of declaring independence that so enamors us, that we identify with it, even though we have for the most part absolutely nothing to do with the we who actually did the writing, did the signing, did the fighting? There's something romantic about this idea of being free. We don't have to do what we're told. We don't have to follow those kind of orders. We don't have to live under an imposed bondage by some authority far, far away. We have the ability to declare for ourselves our freedom and then to live our lives accordingly. And I think it is that concept, that conceptual we, that we are the people who think that way. I think that is what speaks to the heart. And by the way, I think that speaks to the heart of all humanity, not just those of us here in America, but I think if you go anywhere in the world and you sit and have a cup of coffee with people and ask them what life is all about, I think you get to that's a basic human desire. This basic human desire to be free, to do it our way. I have Frank Sinatra now playing in the back of my head. I did it my way. So this is where Emmett Fox and his idea of the historical destiny of the United States starts to come into play. If we go back to what I said from Dr. Holmes, the divine has created us out of itself, but had to leave us alone to make the discovery. We had to discover ourself. We had to discover our unity with all of life, and we had to discover that our true birthright is freedom. But we haven't always been acting as if we are free. And because of that, we have imposed bondage upon ourselves. So we can use the heat of a fire to warm our bath water, to cook our food, to warm our house, or we can use it to harm ourselves. If we inadvertently stick our hand too close to the fireplace, we'll get burned. And the thermodynamics, the laws, the physics of fire, they don't care. They don't have anything personally for or against you. It's just fire doing what it does. It's just combustion. Oxygen, fuel, and heat combined, and you have fire. So whether the fire is used to do something that we would call good, provide comfort for ourselves, or to do something we would call bad, to burn ourselves, to burn our houses down, all those kind of things. The laws of fire are completely independent when it comes to that. They don't have an opinion. They just do what they do. And what Dr. Holmes tells us is that we, in our ignorance, because it was necessary that we be created in ignorance, that we could not be created fully informed, otherwise we would not be individuals, that in our ignorance we have misused the very law that would set us free, the law of mind. Now, Emmett Fox goes a little bit deeper when he goes into this pamphlet I was telling you about. It's called The Historical Destiny of the United States, something about American money, the meaning of American money, or the mystery of American money. You know all the symbols on the back of the dollar bill, the pyramid with the top removed and the eye, the one eye looking at you, and all these things. He kind of goes through that symbolism and what that symbolism means. But we have to very, very briefly touch on involution and evolution that we talked about a couple weeks ago. So Thomas Troward says that we are at the doorway, if you will. We have just stepped through the doorway of the kingdom, the fifth step of evolution. Right? We are just now recognizing our spiritual nature. We are just now learning to appreciate ourselves as spiritual beings. Up until now, we've kind of been caught up in the idea that we are only human and engaged in the human struggles, the wars, and all those kind of things. But now we are starting to recognize ourselves as spiritual beings. Now we can start to see the evolution of our spiritual nature. If we can take a deep breath and come back far enough, we can see that in the beginning, in the book of Genesis, in the beginning, God said, "Let there be," and there was this unfoldment, this evolution, this unfoldment. And as us, it has reached the point where we are now becoming aware of our spiritual nature. Now, Emmett Fox would tell us that with every step of evolution, remember Emmett Fox was a student of Thomas Troward, with every step of evolution, if we look at evolution itself, we see two characteristics of each leap or each unfoldment, each step of evolution. That as life has moved forward, expressing itself through the different phases of evolution, with each phase there's two things. There's a greater degree of intelligence, and there's a greater degree of mobility. So you could say, for example, that algae is more intelligent than a rock, but it doesn't move much. It can kind of migrate from rock to rock, but it can't get up and walk. We can look at plants and we say, well, plants, they can move. Some of them have runners they can put out. Some of them can actually move. They can sway, as I talked last week. They can turn the leaves over. We move into the animal kingdom, and the animal kingdom is even more intelligent than the plant kingdom. You see the things on the internet now with the crows bending a paper clip to make it into a hook so they can pull something out of a confined space. There's an intelligence there, and there's a mobility. They can fly, they can walk, all these kind of things. And then we come to humanity. The greatest intelligence on the planet, just ask us, we'll tell you. and a greater mobility. We can even use that intelligence to build planes and ships and trains and rocket ships and all those kind of things. So we start to see, as Emmett Fox would tell us, we start to see that with each phase of evolution in nature, a greater expression of mobility, a greater expression of intelligence, and a greater expression of freedom. Freedom to move, freedom to choose, freedom to decide, And Dr. Fox puts that into historical context. This is why I started with talking about history. He puts it into historical context of saying, if you look at the way societies have evolved, that we kind of have been moving into greater degrees of freedom with each iteration of governments, from going there might be a chair, a council or something like that. And also in the ancient societies, there was the idea that the most important thing was the society itself, and that each individual was only important in terms of what they could contribute to the society. So if the individual needed to die for the society to live, well, that was okay. That was kind of a meaningful thing, because it was more important that society live. that kind of evolved, into some of the city states and the nation states. But again, the individual was not as important as the state. The individual didn't have kind of the right to say no if the state decided to send them to war. I think it was Socrates kind of wrote a piece on that. That the individual can't say no, because they wouldn't exist. They wouldn't have their freedom if the state hadn't given it to them, and they needed to be willing to give their lives to that state. You kind of move into the feudal system, the kings and castles and those kind of things. And here's an interesting shift and an interesting concept. But basically, the people were being given a certain amount of protection by the armies that the king raised, but the people were subjects, and the land belonged to the monarchies, to the kings, and the people could work the land, and the people could make what living they could off the land, and they had to pay their taxes to the land. But they were still subjects. They didn't have their individual freedoms. Excuse me. You start to see that changing if you look back at the history of England, and the Magna Carta and the English Civil War. There started to be kind of an evolution of consciousness that said, no, you see, we the governed, we the individuals, we the governed, we are important. We are important in our own right, and we have a certain right to be free. We have a certain right to have an input into the decisions that are made. And this was a big shift. This happened, I think around the year 1000, 1100, somewhere around there. That the people themselves, that we the people as they existed at that time, they started to realize that we have a certain ability. We have a certain self-worth, a certain value, and that needs to be recognized. So Dr. Fox takes it, and if you look at the migration then, is that what happened is that individuals, the European individuals who kind of came from this mindset that it didn't have to be the old feudal way, it didn't have to be the servitude way, but we could come to the United States, which in those days was the colonies, and we could live here. It was only natural that the people who came seeking freedom, in many cases, the people who came here were seeking religious freedom because their religious ideas were different and were being persecuted where they lived. So the people who came here had a mindset of, we don't have to do it the old way, that the individual needs to have a certain say. So what Dr. Fox is saying is that the historical destiny, then the evolution of the government of the United States must be one that will eventually lead to a greater expression of the individual self, a greater responsibility of the individual self. That because it is the nature of the human soul, to discover its magnificence, to discover its freedom. Now, to me, if you stop and look at the Declaration of Independence as if it were a prayer, an affirmative prayer, a spiritual mind treatment, is that what happened is the writers of the Declaration started off by acknowledging what God is and what we are. We are endowed by the Creator with certain God-given rights. The Creator created and gave rights, and amongst those being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Interestingly enough, it also says all men are created equal and given these rights. And yet the very people who wrote those words did not believe that all men were equal. They did not believe that black men were equal. They did not believe that women were equal. All right? So there was, as I talked a couple of weeks ago, there was a mixture. There was mixture of absence or lack in their idea of what all meant. what did it mean? Did it mean all white men? Did it mean all landowners? What did it mean? See, there was a restriction, there was a limitation. But nevertheless, the spiritual truth that they declared was that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain rights. They then accepted that. They declared that they would accept it, and they declared that they would do whatever needed to be done. Right? They pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And if you think of the steps that we teach in spiritual mind treatment, affirmative prayer, we start with thinking what God is. We then declare that we are one with that. And then that the very things that we are declaring must be so. And we release it. We let it go. We know that there's a power that is taking hold of that, the power of the law of mind, and is making it so and unfolding it. And if you read through the Declaration of Independence, I think you will see that this is very much what the signers did. Now, what's interesting to me is as I said, we understand that their idea of inclusiveness was flawed. But yet, they made that declaration, and they released that declaration, and they vowed to do whatever needed to be done. And the evolution, that was the involution, the declaration, but the evolution of it was that the wrongs that existed had to become righted. They had to become righted. There was a power at work that they had set into motion by which these things had to be righted. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't something that just the old ways didn't give up easily. We fought a bloody war. We started the process of equality of the races, a process that is still going on today. Later on, we had women's suffrage, and we started the process with the right to vote and of women's equality, a process that is still unfolding today. See, I think we're still trying to learn that we're all one. We are all one. We are all expressions of the divine, regardless of race, regardless of gender. We are all one. And it's not going to be until we reach that point and we can love one another as brothers, then we're going to have the peace that we talk about. But my point is that there was an involution and there was an evolution. There was a recognition that people identify with, and the recognition that we, meaning me, when I'm saying we, I'm meaning me, that's what people do. We have a right to be free. We have a right to govern ourselves. We have a right to choose for ourselves. We have a right to decide for ourselves. And if you think about that as a driving impulse that's driving humanity, then I think you can see the hope for humanity. Then I see that you think you can look down the road and you can say that, yes, this is all, where we are right now is pretty messy, but it's all in the process of unfolding. The old ideas are struggling to give up their ways, and there's wars and rumors of wars, and there's discrimination, and there's inequality, and there's all these other things, but they are in the process of leaving. They are in the process of leaving because the destiny of the human soul is freedom, to be free from bondage, to discover our own selves. And this then brings me to the point of, when we do that, when we declare our freedom, what is it that we are being free from? What is it that we want to be free from? And what is it that we are due to do with our freedom? So in a historical context, it was to be free from the outward influence, the external influence of other people imposing their ideas upon us. But I think if we take that a step further, if we look at it from the spiritual point of view, I think that what we ultimately recognize that we are trying to be free from is the limiting ideas. The ideas of separation, the ideas that bind us are the ideas that tell us, as we talked last week, the ideas of separation and apartness. That what we are trying to free ourselves from in declaring our freedom is freedom from all ideas of lack, all ideas of limitation. And like the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, we have to follow through with our commitment. We have to be willing to do whatever needs to be done. We have to pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to our spiritual practice, to removing from our own consciousness and therefore from some part of collective consciousness all of the ideas that limit us. And we ask ourselves then, well, what is it that we are to do with this freedom? Are we to use this freedom? Are we to use this discovery of the spiritual laws, of the power of affirmative prayer? Are we to use these to get more stuff, to have more things, to make more money, to have a better house? Is that the purpose of it? Well, there's nothing wrong with those things if they don't distract us from our primary purpose. And this is where the idea of license, liberty, or liberation comes in. See, we recognize that the bondage that we believe that we have experienced as human beings has been self-imposed. It is because that is where the unfoldment of human consciousness exists. We believe that we're subject to. We believe that we can't do this or we can't do that. We abdicate our responsibility to choose and decide and let someone else choose and decide for us. And it appears as if we are bound. We then say, well, no, I'm not bound in that way. I am free. But what does that freedom mean? Does that freedom mean that we can do whatever we want without consequence? That's what I mean by license. Just go out and do whatever you want. Rob, steal, kill, do whatever you want because you're free. And it doesn't mean that at all. We know that doesn't mean that because there are consequences. You see, eventually what we learn, and I think eventually what prods the human consciousness out of that level one is that we recognize that there are consequences and that the consequences that we are experiencing are a result of what we believe. It is done unto us according to our belief. So we start to wish to have different consequences, better consequences in our lives, and therefore we get busy with the work at hand, which is to change what we believe. So we've moved from bondage, we've abandoned the idea of license. We are now into liberty. And we say, but why liberty? What does true liberty mean? Does true liberty mean having a better human life? Making a better human life? Or is it really liberation? Is it really liberating ourselves from the ideas that we are only human and truly embracing and stepping into our spiritual nature? So I would say if you think of the historical destiny of the United States as being something that Dr. Emmett Fox was able to kind of show the evolution of human consciousness moving towards a greater degree of liberty and self-governing and self-responsibility, I think the end of that, if we will take our minds all the way to the end of that, is that eventually we will realize it's not about building better human governments, although that's something that we ought to do while we're here. It's not about making life easier and more comfortable, although certainly that does happen as we grow, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that shouldn't be the objective. That shouldn't be the purpose. I think eventually what we realize is that the divine has created us out of itself and left us alone to make that discovery. And when we finally make that discovery, when we finally step into the fullness of that what we realize is liberation is when we no longer identify with the we that is human. We no longer get caught up in the we that is experiencing the drama of the human experience and the human condition. But we start to identify with the I, Not the ego I, not the me, but the I am, the spirit, the creator, the love, the singularity, the unity. So as we take time this weekend to celebrate something that happened a long, long time ago, I invite you to take time to celebrate your own declaration of independence, your own awakening, your own realization that there's nothing that will bind you except your consciousness, and there is nothing that will loose you except your consciousness. And that what you're seeking is not liberty, but what you're seeking is liberation. It is time to let go of the belief that we are merely human beings and that after we die we become spiritual beings. For we are as much spiritual beings now as we will ever be. But we must declare that to be so. We must accept that to be so. And we must be willing to do whatever we can possibly do to engage in our spiritual practice in order to release and let go of the old ideas of bondage and limitation and of lack and of only, and to accept the true nature of our soul. Its destiny of freedom, its destiny of knowledge, and its destiny of unification. The Divine Mind created us out of itself and left us alone to make that discovery. I invite you today to declare your intention to complete that discovery in this lifetime. And so it is.